Eternity for two. A middle-aged woman sat behind the bar. Her head was lowered helplessly. The woman's disheveled, wavy hair was of some indeterminate gray color. There were probably a lot of grays in it already, and the woman obviously cared little about dyeing it regularly. The woman was wearing a sleeveless cotton tank top and a medium-length denim skirt. These clothes were of a musty color, badly sunburned. The woman's arms, exposed to the shoulder by the sleeveless T-shirt, were still beautiful. Tanned and trim, with well-defined muscles. The woman's face was also covered by a thick tan. One could assume that she was engaged in physical labor or actively exercised in a gym or in the fresh air. But as soon as the observer's gaze turned to the woman's face, the thought of a gym fell away. Her eyes were rimmed with dark circles. The bags under her lower eyelids gave away sleepless nights, or perhaps a regular couple of glasses of wine before bed, clearly unnecessary. However, there were no drink glasses in front of the woman at the bar. She simply sat at the bar and relaxed. The bartender approached her from his side of the bar and gently called out, "Hey, Annie, what do you want this time? The usual?" The woman lifted her head, ran her fingers through her messy hair, and gave the young, good-looking bartender a tired smile before answering. "Hi, Sammy. Yeah, the usual." Then Annie sat up a little straighter, leaned her elbows on the bar, spread them wide, and rested her chin on her folded hands. She watched indifferently how the bartender mixed a drink. The bartender handed her a glass and said jokingly, "There, your usual non-alcoholic cocktail is ready." Annie slowly slid her drink glass toward her. She looked over her glass of orange-colored drink with concentration and set it back on the bar. Just as Annie was about to take her drink glass and bring it to her lips again, a new customer took the seat next to her. Annie glanced sideways at the man and quickly averted her gaze. As usual, she had no desire to look at the customers in the bar. But this man was right beside her, and it would have been rude not to pay attention to him. Something seemed to push Annie from the inside and make her look at this man again. Annie looked closely at her neighbor. The man was clearly too good-looking for her to look at him. Dressed in a fashionable business suit, he stood out sharply from this bar's crowd of ordinary customers. While Annie peered at him, the man made himself comfortable on a bar stool and placed his briefcase and laptop on the floor beneath his feet. He glanced quickly at Annie, too. The woman immediately lowered her gaze, clearly embarrassed. But the stranger just nodded to her affably and turned to the bartender. "Hey, give me something non-alcoholic. I've got a long way to go." He had to add this because the bartender looked at this customer with surprise, expecting the order of a regular beer or something stronger. The new bar customer took the drink served to him, paid the bartender, and sipped from his straw. Annie was sitting next to him and felt bad. She felt bad because this man was no longer paying attention to her. Even if she was as untidy a lady as she appeared to him now, she was still a woman. That alone involuntarily demanded more attention to her person. Then the bartender turned to her again. "Annie, would you like another drink?" She raised her head and, awakened from her unhappy thoughts, replied, "Of course, my dear." As she answered the bartender, there suddenly sounded an unfamiliar playful note in the woman's voice. The bartender looked at her in surprise, having understood everything, turned his gaze to the man, her neighbor. The bartender knew how his customers behaved, sober or not, happy or sad, furious or desperate. And the way Annie addressed him now was not her style. Yes, Sammy had not known Annie before. He only sees her as she is now, a tired, almost killed by the hard work of a middle-aged woman. This playfully upbeat tone of the conversation was not the style Annie, the bartender, had known for the past couple of years. After losing her husband, She became a regular at this bar. Annie lived alone on a remote farm in their county and came to this bar twice a week, in the evenings, not for a discharge, but just to be among people. Although Annie did not even touch her first drink, she ordered it again. What was wrong with her? Is this stranger next to her getting on her nerves? But she had never met him. What is the matter, then? At the same moment, the man sitting next to Annie moved slightly away from her on his bar stool, turned fully toward her, and stared at her frankly, examining her face and figure. He regarded her as if looking for confirmation of some hunch of his. At first, the concerned expression on his face changed to one of amazement. "Annie?" he asked the woman, at the same time reaching out her hand to pull aside the hair that had fallen over her face. Annie looked up at her neighbor again, utterly surprised. What was it to him about her name? Did he know her? But she could not remember if she had ever met this handsome man. And the man was handsome. His cool, clean-shaven chin gave off a stubbornness, and his dark brown eyes drew the eye in stark contrast to his almost gray hair. Not only was he dressed in the latest business fashion, but his face and thick hair were perfectly groomed. His dark, wispy eyebrows gave the stranger's face a stern expression. Now, though, genuine surprise gave him the face of a mere precocious gray-haired boy. Annie, no longer tearing her gaze from the man's eyes, also turned her whole body toward him and leaned her hand on the bar counter, the other resting on her hip. There was no coquetry or challenge in this pose. It was just a way for Annie to keep her balance on the high and narrow bar stool. The woman looked directly into the man's eyes without looking away. It seemed as if a fire was about to break out between them, so tense were the expressions on their faces and postures. Suddenly something flashed in Annie's brain. She realized where she had seen the man. It was the manager of the bank where, years ago, she and her husband, then still in good health, had got a loan for the development of their family farm. Somehow the manager remembered her name, but Annie could not understand why. After all, she had frankly forgotten it. More precisely, until now, she had forgotten all about some banker who had glimpsed into her and her husband's life and quickly disappeared from view. The man, meanwhile, realized from Annie's lucid gaze that she remembered him, too, just as he remembered her. The stranger held out his hand to Annie for a handshake, saying, "Good afternoon, I am Elvis, Elvis Medra. You and I met many years ago. I never thought I'd see you again." Annie looked at him in bewilderment. Why did he need her? What did he want from her? Was he hoping to see her? For what? In her life, this man was just a moment of her past life, which was now gone. With the loss of her husband, Annie became withdrawn, and even the occasional visit from her adult children could not lift her out of her depression. Of course, there was plenty of work on the farm, and the hired laborers did much of what her husband and herself had done in the past. But the whole operation had to be managed, and so Annie had no time for her personal life, much less her memories. Everything she wanted to remember was in her memory. What she did not need ended up forgotten in the back of her head, and it would never be used. To break the long and awkward silence, Elvis held out his cell phone to Annie, offering to look at some pictures. At first, Annie did not understand what was in the picture. But then her eyes grew sharper. She sharply took the cell phone from the man's hands and, enlarging the picture, began examining its details. In the picture was her. "When was this picture taken? Where?" she exclaimed, looking at the man in surprise. "And why?" Already quieter, she added, still not returning the man's cell phone. She only shifted her immensely surprised gaze from the picture to the man. He replied, very pleased with the surprise. "This was at your farm when you got the business loan. Your husband and I were talking a little away from you, and you were feeding the chickens in a pen. I took a picture of you secretly, and I never showed that picture to anyone." Annie could not come to her senses. "But why? I almost forgot you, forgive me," she mumbled, sliding her cell phone back to the man. Then Annie wrapped her palms around her drink glass as if it might help her with her embarrassment. Elvis pulled back a little embarrassed, but almost immediately responded by looking into Annie's eyes. "You saved my son's life." Annie raised her eyebrows in complete surprise. There was no way she could understand what he was talking about. Elvis continued, "You were giving blood at the hospital when my son was brought in with a knife wound. He was 10 years old. Our hospital didn't have a blood supply that matched his blood type. Then the medical staff started asking visitors to the hospital if anyone could donate blood of that rare type for the young man who had just been admitted. You were there and didn't hesitate to give your blood to my son." Annie's face brightened. She understood the event in question. Yes, she did and had forgotten about it. It was natural for her to just help people and forget about it. Elvis continued his story. "My son got well and continued his studies. Soon after that, we moved to another county where we got a job and never came around here again until you and your husband applied for a loan. When I was handling your loan agreement, I realized from your picture on the application that you might have been the woman who saved my son's life." The man was quiet for a moment and continued his story. "Then when I saw you at our bank, at the meeting to sign the loan agreement, I recognized you immediately. But you probably did not recognize me because I was near my son's room and I could not enter it until his life was out of danger. So I didn't bother you with this event, not daring to mix up such an important moment for you and your husband by translating our communication on a business matter into personal memories." Annie was still silent and staring ahead of her as if the polished wood of the bar had been projected on a movie projector showing a newsreel of her life. Memories of that moment in her life flashed through Annie's mind. She and her husband had been so happy then, and everything was supposed to be fine. And they had been until the moment he left this world. Meanwhile, Elvis continued his story. Only his voice was a little huskier than it had been at the beginning of their conversation. "And so, having made my way to your farm while the bank was inspecting the actual conditions of your business, I secretly took a picture of you to remember you." On an impulse, Annie looked at Elvis tenderly and ran her hand lightly over his shoulder as if to support and reassure him. Both froze. It had been so long since Annie had touched a man's shoulder. And now this man needed her support. He could see that the memories of the days when his son was on the brink of life and death were weighing on his heart. Feeling the woman's touch, Elvis looked at Annie in surprise but in gratitude. He did not flinch, nor did he move away from her. He took her gesture of sympathy for granted. Somehow, in telling Annie this story, he was sure she could not react any other way. The man instinctively reached out his hand to Annie as well, but he did not touch her face as before but covered, like a warm blanket, the wrist of her hand that lay on the countertop of the bar. So they froze and stared into each other's eyes without saying another word. It seemed to both of them that this moment of understanding and sympathy would last forever. Even so, Annie was the first to look away. Her whole being was crying out for understanding and sympathy. And this man won her over by how carefully he kept his appreciation for her, the woman who had once gratuitously helped his child. And now she needed help. She needed to know that the man needed her. And there he was, right in front of her. What more could she want? But this encounter would only last these 15 minutes that Elvis would sit at the bar beside her. He wants nothing more from her or from this place. He was just passing through and met her. Elvis kept his hand on Annie's arm and looked at her. He did not understand the change of expression on her face. A second ago, Annie's face had expressed warmth and tenderness, but now a wave of despair ran through it, replaced by a kind of detachment, as if she had struggled with some thoughts and now succumbed to them. The man suddenly realized he could not part with this extraordinary woman. He and his son owed so much to her. Elvis had long ago parted ways with his son's mother but remained friends with her for his son's sake. The man was free, but still had not found his new life partner. But was she free, his savior? Elvis cautiously asked Annie, "Annie, are you? How is your husband doing?" Annie immediately turned her face away from him and, looking sadly out the window, quietly replied, "And he's not living anymore. He left us not too long ago, gone forever." Elvis raised his eyebrows in genuine surprise and replied in a sympathetic tone, "I'm so sorry. My condolences." But everything in his soul boiled over with the realization that this wonderful woman was free. Now he had got to know her better. They are both free, but how to do it? And then it hit him, it is simple. Elvis touched the woman's arm, speaking in a heartfelt tone, "Annie, would you mind giving me some of your time? I'd like to see your farm. After all, it's something I've been a part of, if only by arranging a loan for you and your husband. I grew up on a farm, but then I went to town, and my parents sold everything before they retired, moving to a town closer to me. I don't have anyone else to come and help feed the chickens or just walk into the barn and smell the hay." Annie, looking Elvis in the eye, turned to Elvis again and, leaning slightly in his direction, replied, "Sure, you can come to our farm whenever you want. I'll be glad to see you." Elvis, obviously elated by this answer, leaned his hand on the barstool and bounced elastically off the barstool to the floor. He looked like a young boy, despite his gray hair. "Thank you so much. I'll be sure to contact you as soon as I finish this work trip. I think that will be in 5 or 6 days. Where can I call to arrange a day and time to visit you at the farm?" Annie pulled out her cell phone and dictated her cell number to the man. She had no other phone number at the farm, only this one. Elvis entered her information into his cell phone and, enthusiastically picking up his briefcase from the floor, brought his palm to his head as if to salute Annie. "Well, see you later," he exclaimed, and held out his hand for a handshake. Annie slowly extended her hand to his. Their palms met. Annie felt an electric current run through her body. It was a shiver from the long-forgotten sensation of a man's hand touching hers. Annie felt this encounter would bring her something extraordinary. This encounter would bring her the warmth of love and understanding, hugs and kisses. "Wow, what am I thinking of?" cut off Annie's reverie. "He's just excited about coming to visit the farm, not about communicating with me. I need to calm down and just say goodbye to him." Annie took her time, however, to remove her palm from Elvis's warm and large palm. She uttered without taking her gaze from his eyes, "You can stay with us at the farm. We have a guest house, and everything is ready for visitors there. Come whenever you like. I'll be waiting for you, Elvis." She called his name for the first time, and it sounded somehow intimate, or rather, so intimate was the tone of her voice. Annie finally took her palm from Elvis's palm and took a step back, letting her know that their conversation was now over, and it was time for him to leave. The man stepped back a little, turned, and headed for the exit. But, being almost at the bar's front door, he turned around once more and, clearly pleased that Annie was still looking at him, waved happily at her. Annie also slowly raised her hand in response to his parting gesture. Now she thought all the bar-goers were looking at her and this stranger. But no one noticed they were talking, and everyone around them was busy with their usual conversations. Annie stood at the bar counter and couldn't believe this meeting was even here. Everything seemed like a blur now. Tomorrow he would forget about her and never come to see her at the farm. She had nothing to look forward to. That grayness of everyday life and depression would come pouring in again. ****. 3 days passed. With each sunrise, Annie's soul was filled with hope for Elvis's arrival, and with each sunset, that hope died. The woman still hoped that Elvis would come to see her, but that hope quickly melted away, like spring snow in the sun. On the third day after meeting Elvis, Annie decided she was done suffering. It was just a pipe dream, and she should forget everything that had happened a couple of days ago at the bar. Nothing had happened. Whoever she had met there. This Elvis guy was just a casual dream. For instance, they did not owe each other anything. Such thoughts swarmed in Annie's head as she went out to the hay barn one warm summer evening to close its gates for the night. It was getting dark. The bright orange sun was setting on the horizon, hiding gradually in the fields of ripe wheat as if it were tucked into bed with a golden down featherbed. Annie closed the heavy barn gate, the movement of which sent a golden dust of dry grass into the air. The stifling and spicy smell of the drying hay stacked in the barn enveloped her, and Annie froze for a second as if wrapped up in this heavy, heat-filled air of the day. The woman closed the barn doors with a large padlock and walked to the corner of the barn to take one last look at the sun. She covered her eyes with her palm and squinted. The sunlight was still strong. Already hiding behind the horizon, its rays were still blinding her eyes. Suddenly, a man's confident footsteps were heard behind Annie. She shuddered, her chest tightening. The woman tensed her whole body but did not turn around. She knew all her employees had gone home, and no one had been seen here before. It could only be him. Elvis' familiar low, heart-piercingly husky voice came from right behind her, close by. "Well, hello, Annie." Annie turned back toward Elvis. Her shoulders straightened. The woman smiled and replied, "Well, hello, Elvis. You're here." It was an affirmation of the fact that he was here with her. Elvis was standing in front of her. If he had wanted to, he could have hugged and kissed Annie. But they both knew they had plenty of time for that now. There was an eternity ahead for the two of them. The end.